In this episode, the featured film takes the viewer and the actors on a much-needed day vacation, showcases the buildings, the streets, and the people of the Eternal City, and introduces another legend from the golden age of Hollywood. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Roman Holiday was released in 1953. Shot in black and white, this film takes place at the same time it was filmed, approximately the early 50s, and the setting is Rome, Italy, the Eternal City. Now the genre is romantic comedy, but I think if there was a subgenre for this movie, it would be the feel-good movie, because it's as good a feel-good movie as has ever been made. As I said, the setting for this feel-good movie is Rome. I think it's an inspired choice. If we have a movie about a princess, a European princess, then it makes sense to film it in Europe, or the scene to be Europe. And they could have chosen many cities. Paris is the first one that comes to mind, Vienna, Amsterdam, Brussels, but they chose Rome. And I think partly because of the stereotype of the Roman life, this joy of life. Gioia di vivere. I was going to say joie de vivre, but that's French. So I think that plays a part in this very inspired choice. The other reason, of course, is because Rome visually is absolutely stunning. And it is important to note that this is one of the earliest pictures, of which there were many, I'm sure, but one of the earliest ones that was shot on location. This entire film was shot in Rome, Italy. So what better background could there be than the city of Rome itself? And in post-war Italy, Rome was visually stunning. For Hollywood audiences, vacation should have an exotic locale, and therefore Rome would definitely qualify as that exotic location. But we have to tell a compelling story. Let's look at what the powers that be might have looked at when they put together this project. They want to tell a story about royalty and their interaction with the regular people. Well, in the late 40s, early 50s, the British royalty were in the papers a lot. And the makers of this film go to great lengths to indicate that this is not the British royal family that they're talking about. They're talking about an unnamed nation that has royalty, and we meet the princess of this royal family. Because we have a vacation movie, a feel-good movie, then the story can't be too heavy. It has to be breezy, it has to be light, but it also has to be compelling. So they set on a princess who is on a diplomatic mission, bouncing from city to city in Europe, and who eventually lands in Rome. This princess is young, early 20s, very attractive. Princesses in Hollywood have to be attractive. So that's a good start point. But we also have a princess who has just come out of her teens, and like all young people, they are yearning to be free. So our first point of conflict is our princess is not happy. In fact, she's kind of grumpy. She throws the odd mild temper tantrum, but she is frustrated with her life. The routine, the day in, day out routine of being royal, being responsible for the state. And at the start of this film, we find out she doesn't like that very much. But the fact is, if you're born into a royal family, if you have this life of incredible privilege, it comes with a lot of responsibilities. As they point out at some moment in the movie, it's not the kind of job that you retire from or leave, although there are a couple of spectacular exceptions to this. But for now, let's just say it is normal for royal personages to stay in the job for life. But that still doesn't sit well with our young princess. She's unhappy. She's tired of the routine. She's tired of being coddled and being told what to do almost every minute of the day. Well, we're in Rome. We have a romantic story, so we have to have a leading man. How about an American in Rome? Well, this would not have been unusual. The end of the Second World War was 1945, and although the majority of ex-servicemen went back to their countries, Canada, the US, Australia, England, many stayed, and this is very common for them to stay. They might stay because they just wanted to chill. They might stay because they might have wanted to see Europe, not from the other side of a gun. They might just wanted to revisit some of the places they had been. So it's quite natural for a percentage of these ex-soldiers to stay in Europe. And in fact, Hollywood had made films about this, and also authors had written books about it. Perhaps the most famous was Ernest Hemingway, who was an ambulance driver in the Great War. And after that war finished, he became a reporter. He wrote for a while for the Toronto Star, and then eventually his first couple of novels were written while he was in France after the war. So we find this American in Rome. He's our leading man, so he's tall, 30-something, boyish face, good-looking, as Hollywood would say, movie star handsome, but not incredibly movie star handsome. And at some point, he is going to meet up with our princess. So our leading man is in Rome, and our princess is in Rome. He's a newspaper man out for a story. She's a princess who ain't happy. And so we're kind of set up here for a very interesting interaction between these two and what will happen when they meet. Sounds like a great light romantic comedy. Almost. There are some dangers that have to be addressed when making such a story. The first danger is with the princess. She's young, attractive, that's fine. She's very privileged, and she's not happy. In fact, she does throw a few little tantrums, not big tantrums. And it'd be very easy for the audience not to like this character. So the makers that be on this film had to make sure that this character becomes sympathetic. She can't be so uptight or so angry that it becomes petty and the audience doesn't care that this extremely privileged person is going through these problems. We have to care about her. She has to be sympathetic. And so it's very important that when this film is written, that the character comes off sympathetically, that we feel her same frustrations and her same pain with the life she has. Given that she's very young, in her early 20s, and she wants to see more of the world than she does from this coddled entourage that she has that protects her from every moment of her day. So that's very important. The second part is our leading man. Now, Hollywood has always liked newspaper men. In fact, some of the early screenwriters in the talkies started as newspaper men, then ended up in Hollywood and wrote movies about being newspaper men. Newspaper men were shown as cynical, snappy dialogue, cigar chomping, with editors who were mean people who were pushing these newspaper men and women. There's a very nice movie with the woman being the newspaper person. And they are predators. Throughout the Hollywood movies, they are shown to be get the story no matter what. Nothing stands in the way of a good story. No emotions, no heart, no soul. So we can't have our hero in Rome be that kind of newspaper man. We got to make him, like I say, mid-30s, kind of boyish looking, handsome, but not too hard-edged. He has to have a softer edge. Maybe he's short of money. Maybe he wants to go back to the US but can't. So he's working for this American newspaper in Rome, doing his stories, but is kind of just barely getting by and perhaps is not terribly happy with his life. That's critical that he is written in a certain way that we care about him. So let's help this by throwing in a friend of his who's a bit of comic relief and adds depth to the movie. And he's brilliantly played by an actor named Eddie Albert. And then let's add a few more characters, local characters from Rome that add, again, more depth and more color to the environment. So we get a nice little picture of what Rome was like in, let's say, between 1950 and 1953. This is where the skill of the writer really comes in, first of all, and there's another critical element I'll mention in a second. No one can be too mean in a feel-good movie. The arguments have to be soft, not harsh. There could be skirmishes, not fights, but skirmishes that are developed comically and not with very serious repercussions. All of it has to come together and in a certain way to describe, using that term in Hollywood, which is very difficult to pin down, and that term is tone. They have to create a tone for this movie that is lighthearted, but compelling and interesting. And this is not easy to do, I don't believe. I believe it's very, very difficult to do. and only the most accomplished screenwriters and anyone else who's involved in the production of this movie can manage. So we have a good story. Everything looks good. There's a lot that can be developed from this story. We have a princess, young princess. We have a newspaper man. Somehow we're going to find a way to get them to meet at the beginning of the story. But the critical element is who is going to play these two parts. No matter how well they're written, I think, if they're not cast properly, it could determine the success or failure of this particular story in this movie. So let's start with the male lead. As I said, he's got to be good looking, tall, boyish, have a real screen presence, and there was an actor I think perfectly suited for this role. His name was Gregory Peck. Now, he was a veteran actor, even in his early 30s. He had been a leading man for several years in Hollywood, done a lot of really nice pictures, and whoever decided to make him our leading man, and how, who knows, but he got the job. Now, he has an elegance and sophistication and class about him, which is important for this movie, I think, even though he is a newspaper man. As I've mentioned before, the other leading actor of this time, who was the epitome of elegance, was Cary Grant. But Gregory Peck had a bit more of an edge to him, a bit more toughness, which you might consider being a newspaper man rather than the extremely elegant Cary Grant. And in fact, Peck's career benefited from this slightly tougher edge because he made some westerns, he played some bad guys, and he played in a terrific action film that at some point in this series I will talk about. The choice of Peck as our male lead is terrific, and I think it works very, very well. He's likable, he's got dimples, he's good looking, he has kind eyes, and even though he's a newspaper man and he wants that story, we feel like there's a soul in him, and that is very important for the tone of this film, which is, again, I say, is lightweight and not heavy. So Peck is a terrific choice. But however, the star of Roman Holiday is the princess. This is what the story is about, is not only her interaction with the newspaper man, but it's her life and how she lives it and who she is as a person. So the casting of the princess was absolutely critical to the success of this film. Early 20s, as I've said, elegant, classy, but girlish in a way too, because she's just come out of her teens. Frustrated and cantankerous, but not to the point of being obnoxious. And I don't know how she was selected, and I don't know who was the person behind it. And in Hollywood, there is no shortage of starlets, screen actresses, very accomplished screen actresses who would like to play such a role, such a well-written role. But the role went to a newcomer, and her name is Audrey Hepburn. Now, Audrey Hepburn actually came from a well-to-do family. She, I think, was born in Belgium, spent a lot of time in England, and spent some time in Holland. I think this is not a bad thing to talk about because when she was in Holland, it was during the Second World War. And in the town she was in, which I believe was Nijmegen, it was occupied by the German army at the time. But not only the German army, but the SS division of that army. So it was a pretty terrible period of time that she survived. If you go online and look at documentaries and things about her early life, she does talk about it, and it was a very, very difficult time. But good for her and good for us that she survived that period. And she ended up in this movie. Now, she was trained as a dancer, so she carries herself very well. She looks great in anything she wears. She's very attractive, maybe better to say pretty, almost possibly to say cute. But she has a class about her as well. She has electricity coming out of her eyes and a megawatt smile, but classy all the same. So it is not difficult for us to see her as Princess Anna. And just an incredible bit of genius to cast her in this role. And she, as I understand it, it was her first Hollywood film. I believe that's true. So kudos to whoever it was, whatever person or persons was, to take a risk, because a newcomer is always a risk, for this very critical role. And in fact, Gregory Peck wanted her billing to be above his because he thought that she was going to kill this role and become a star. And guess what happened? After the release of Roman Holiday in 1953, she was an instant superstar. She made many terrific films in the next few years and had a wonderful career for, I think, at least 20 years, and is a bona fide legend of the golden age of Hollywood. So we have our leading man, we have our leading lady. They are so well suited to these roles. We have them in a nice little story. At the beginning of the movie, we find out that our princess is unhappy. But the way it's written and the way it unfolds, we kind of feel for her. And we kind of feel sorry for her, even though she's this incredibly privileged person. We see our leading man. He's an everyday guy, doesn't have a lot of money, is likable, has a really fun friend. And after a night together with his friend and other people, he ends up running into, and I won't say how, he ends up running into our princess. And then the story unfolds. And it's a vacation for a day. And I believe the execution of it is just wonderful. And one of the reasons that this film comes off so well, I believe, which is my prejudice, which is the script. And I believe the script in this film is spectacular. And the person who wrote that script is our old friend Dalton Trumbo, who I spoke about in the last episode as the scriptwriter for the movie Spartacus. Now this is early 1950s. Dalton Trumbo was a very successful Hollywood screenwriter, but there's a problem. And that problem begins during the Second World War. At some point in the Second World War, the Soviet Union becomes an ally of the Western powers, the US, Great Britain, France, because they're fighting the Germans. And for a couple of years, they were the only army that was in the field against the Germans, the rest of Europe being just occupied by them. So there was a big push in North America, the US and in Britain, to promote the Soviet Union as our allies, as our friends. In fact, they called Joseph Stalin Uncle Joe. So they wanted the entire Western world to get behind the Soviet Union, to speak kindly of them, because they needed them to continue fighting the Germans. Well, in Hollywood, of course, as I've mentioned, it's not surprising to find writers, directors, actors who are left-leaning. That's perfectly normal. In fact, I'd like to think that the creative process lends itself to people who are more left-leaning than right-leaning, if we think of being more humanistic than they are business types, whatever. And some of these people were socialists and some of these people were communists. And they, of course, were quite happy to support the Soviet Union. Then the war ended in 1945. And our friend Uncle Joe stopped being Uncle Joe. The countries that the Soviet army had kicked the Germans out of were countries that they decided to stay in. And so they occupied some Eastern European countries and made them satellite states of the Soviet Union, which the US of A and Great Britain didn't like one bit. And that created a problem. So the Soviet Union was no longer a friend of the West. They were now enemies. And within a very short period of time, not being friends and being enemies led to a Cold War, which is a war without armies fighting each other, but there's definitely two sides and they don't like each other one bit, the Western side and the Soviet side. But what happened to those people who supported the Soviets during the war? It was no surprise that post-war, and in the next, let's say, 5 to 7 years, most of these people were still socialists, were still in the members of the Communist Party, but now they were no longer supporting an ally, they were supporting an enemy. So once the Cold War began, the US, I don't know if it's a craze, but it's safe to say that they hated communism, they feared communism. They thought that because the Soviet army had taken over some countries in Eastern Europe, that they were dead set on taking over the entire world. Whether that was a legitimate fear or not is a debatable point. But the government hated them, and they wanted to find communists. Who are they? Where are they? Where are they? And let's get rid of them. So they created a committee. The House Un-American Activities Committee, I think it was 1947, late 40s, and their job was to look throughout the country, find these communists, and deal with them. Now, it's important to note that to be a communist in the United States at any time is not a crime. It was not illegal. But those were the times. They thought that anyone who was a communist was in fact an agent for the Soviet Union and was dead set upon overthrowing the US of A. Of course, this committee was very powerful, and it was, and remember, they were fighting people who had not committed a crime. So this was a terrible period in the US. Many people's lives were destroyed. Well, this committee needed publicity, and they needed support of the public. And the best way to get publicity was to go after Hollywood, because they did know that there were a lot of left-leaning individuals in Hollywood. So they went after Hollywood, and they said to the producers of Hollywood, you either are with us or we're going to destroy you. And Hollywood was still making movies and still wanted to make money. And they saw this committee as a threat to their existence. So the funny thing is, the 50s, as I've mentioned before, was a tremendous decade for Hollywood production. Many, many wonderful films were made during this decade. But there was a dark side to this decade as well. And what happened was Hollywood agreed to the demands of this committee and stopped hiring people who they considered either socialist or communist or undesirables. In fact, they created what is known as a blacklist, and they would not let anyone work who they had put on this list. And one of those people was Dalton Trumbo. So what happened was the House Un-American Activities Committee subpoenaed various personages from Hollywood to come and testify. And what they wanted them to do was to confirm that they were communists, confirm that they were unpatriotic, confirm that they were working for the Soviet Union and were planning to overthrow the country. Well, 10 of these people refused to answer the questions of the committee in that way. They said that it was unconstitutional, which most people nowadays think it was. They said that it was not a crime to be a communist, and so why were they being summoned to this committee? What happened was the committee found them in contempt of committee, which meant that they didn't answer the questions the way they wanted, and so the committee had the power to imprison them. And 10 of these people, ever since known as the Hollywood 10, went to prison, and one of those was Dalton Trumbo. One of the darkest periods in post-war U.S. history. Well, a year later, Trumbo got out of prison, and like anybody else in his situation, what they did for a living was write movies or direct movies or whatever, and that's the only way they knew how to make a living. And they had families to support, and they had to make money. So they came up with this great idea. They would continue to write movies as long as they could find sympathetic individuals who were not on the blacklist, who would claim to be the writer of a film and take credit for it, but behind the scenes it was actually a blacklisted writer who had written the movie, almost, in most cases, 100% of that movie. And this was the case for Roman Holiday. Roman Holiday was released under a different name than Dalton Trumbo's, and incredibly, or not so incredibly if you like the film like I do, it won an award for Best Screenplay. But that award did not go to Dalton Trumbo because he didn't write the movie officially. But eventually, after the blacklist was over, and many years later, in fact 33 years later, the family of Dalton Trumbo, who had died in the 70s, was given the award for this film 33 years later. His tremendous work on this movie did not affect his status. He remained blacklisted until Spartacus in 1960, when the blacklist was more or less over with, thanks to Spartacus, thanks to Kirk Douglas, and thanks to President Kennedy, which I go into a bit of detail about in the previous episode. But I also have to mention the movie Trumbo, which came out quite recently, starring Bryan Cranston, which details this early 50s period when Trumbo wrote Roman Holiday. Very nicely done, and I think it's a terrific film, and I think well worth seeing to get a feel for this particular writer, what he went through, and how talented he was, and how he somehow survived this very, very dark period of U.S. history. So I love really good scripts, and I love Roman Holiday because it's a spectacularly well-written movie. I just don't think a feel-good, lightweight comedy movie is easy to make. It looks so effortless. It's so smooth. They've got these terrific young actors and actresses to play these parts. How tough could it be? But as I've tried to explain, I think it is very, very difficult to make such a film so that it works. And I think Roman Holiday works spectacularly well. And I think the lion's share of responsibility for that is Dalton Trumbo, the scriptwriter, and the people who hired Audrey Hepburn and Gregory Peck. But I'd also like to say a word about the director. Now, I've said before that I don't know how much influence a director has on a movie. The most gifted directors who have styles and fingerprints that are easy to acknowledge, yes, you can see how their films stand out. But for many really good directors, who's to say if it's their vision that is on the film, or the producers, or even the stars? But the director for Roman Holiday was a fellow by the name of William Wyler. And William Wyler was a veteran of Hollywood, had made many, many, many acclaimed films, and was also one of those directors who joined the armed forces to film the story of the Second World War where he was. Now, he was in, I think, the Air Force and flew some bombing runs with, if not the American Air Force, then also the British Air Force. Like the other directors who joined the war effort, he came back a changed man. They had seen the horrors of war. They had made, many of them, lightweight comedies or lightweight films, nothing with very many serious themes, and they came back changed. And Wyler made very serious and very well received films after 1945. He had made some lightweight films before the war, and he didn't want to go back to that. Now, I don't know what was going through Wyler's mind. He was a very accomplished director, and I'm sure the powers that be, the producers of Roman Holiday, wanted to have someone who really knew their business to direct this film. I'd like to think that he saw the project, he saw the screenplay, and even though he was averse to making these lightweight films, I'd like to think he just couldn't pass it up. So whatever his contribution was to this film, I'd have to say that whatever it was, a lot or a little, his contribution helped to make this such a terrific film. Now, in any era, I think a feel-good movie is a good thing. We need tough films and films that get you angry, and as I said, make your blood boil, like Paths of Glory. But it's also nice to have a good film at any time. And in post-war Europe, unlike North America, which had started to see early on some real prosperity after the end of the Second World War, Europe took a long time to recover, especially countries like Italy, France, and of course Germany, that were absolutely devastated by the war. So to use Italy as the setting for this film, I think was inspired because it's not inundated with tourists, full of cars. When you watch the film, again, it was shot on location in Rome, the entire film. It doesn't look like, I'm sure, what Rome looks like today with the so-called hellish traffic that it's famous for and just seas of tourists everywhere. It's not a crime to be a tourist, but imagine being in Rome when it wasn't overcrowded, when you could jump on a Vespa and drive around the city and see this eternal city. So that's why I think the selecting of Rome as the location for this film was inspired, a very inspired choice. And so when you watch this film, it's so breezy, it's so light. Audrey Hepburn sparkles from beginning to end. The chemistry between her and Gregory Peck is undeniable. And I defy anyone not to have a tear at the end of this film because it is so well done. You don't want it to end, but you know it has to end when you understand what's going on in the story after the first few minutes, but you don't want it to end. I wish I could jump on a Vespa and race around the streets of Rome today, but I can't. Too much traffic, too many tourists. But I can jump on that Vespa vicariously through our leading man and our leading lady. Hold on tight and watch Roman Holiday from the 22nd row.